Welcome to our February Shosuki service, and it's really nice to see all of you. I have to take my hi, nice to see all of you. I need my binoculars to see the back row there, but yeah, nice to see all of you today. And I think, as you all know, the monthly Shosuki service we say presents an opportunity to encounter the Dharma. And so we experience this Dharma, this truth of impermanence in the loss of our loved ones. But, also we're encountering this same Dharma every day in the news as we, witness the tragic and disturbing increase of violence in our cities. And of course, I think for a long time, maybe even since the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, immigration has a history of being very controversial in America. But according to a recent nonpartisan Pew Research poll, a majority of Americans don't agree with the way the current administration is handling immigration, one which has resulted in American citizens dying in the act of protest, one which I think represents another kind of loss. It seems that we are losing the basic democratic and egalitarian values that have always distinguished America from the authoritarian nations of the world. And so what I wanted to discuss in my talk today is, in fact, this word Dharma, and hopefully how the Dharma offers us guidance in our lives. I think we know that regarding this word Dharma, it has two basic meanings in Buddhism. On the one hand, it refers to the everyday events of our lives, such as the experience of difficulties, of impermanence, of things not going the way we'd like them to, which of course includes the loss of our loved ones as well as the events in the news. But on the other hand, the word Dharma also refers to the teachings of the Buddha. And today I'd like to discuss this aspect of the Dharma as teachings, and in particular, the symbolic representations of the teachings here on our altar, including the central statue of Amida Buddha. And, all these manifestations of the teaching function together as a kind of resource or guide for us. They all reflect the efforts of the great teachers in our tradition to make the Dharma, the wisdom of the Buddhist teachings, accessible to us. Well, today, regarding this wisdom of the Buddhist teachings, I wanted to share with you some material that I recently found while digging through some of the essays of my teachers, and this material comes from the late Dr. Taitetsu Unno. I think many of you know Dr. Unno. He was the author of the famous book, River of Fire, River of Water, and he was someone that I was very lucky to meet way back in the 1990s when he was a lecturer here at one of our North America district retreats. And so Dr. Unno was discussing a central term in our Jodo Shinshu tradition, which is the Nembutsu, generally understood as the recitation of Namu Amida Butsu, and which is usually translated as, I take refuge in Amida Buddha. But now, because the understanding, to understand Dr. Unno's essay, I think requires at least a basic understanding, or basic knowledge of Amida and his story, I'd like to briefly review with you Amida's story, which is told in the largest sutra. And by the way, because English requires gender-specific pronouns, when we discuss Amida Buddha in English, it is hard to avoid using male pronouns like he or him. But I'd like you to keep in mind that this is simply a language convention because Amida transcends gender and embraces all beings. Well, in the story of the largest sutra, after meeting and being inspired by a great Buddha, the Bodhisattva Dharmakara resolves or vows to become a Buddha himself and establish a great Pure Land designed to bring all beings to awakening. And after a long and extremely arduous effort, through a sincere, humble practice of visiting, bowing to, and listening to countless teachers, he fulfills his vows and becomes Amida Buddha and establishes the Pure Land, the land or realm, we would say, permeated with this humble bowing spirit. And then here, besides its meaning of taking refuge, the Namu of Namu Amida Butsu also has the meaning of bowing. And this is why it's said that the full name of Amida Buddha actually is Namu Amida Butsu. This is because since the word Namu also signifies the humble bowing practice that resulted in the fulfillment of Amida's vows, then we can see that Amida's practice became his name. Namu Amida Butsu, bowing Amida Buddha. But getting back to Dr. Unno's essay, I think what was particularly striking about his discussion of the Nembutsu, Namu Amida Butsu, was his seeing its relevance in our current modern times. This essay was actually from quite a few years ago, but it still seems quite relevant. He was making the point that when discussing the conflicts that we see in contemporary society, and certainly in politics, there is a role Shin Buddhism can play in reducing conflict. And he emphasized that this role really has nothing to do with the fact that Shin Buddhism still has elements of Japanese culture, for example, in its use of Japanese language in its rituals. And this is because the real problem that needs addressing today, he said, is not a cultural or ethnic issue. It's what he termed excessive individualism. This has to do with how one sees themselves in relation to the world around them. I don't know about you, but actually, when I think about the violence and turmoil unfolding in the world today, I think that Dr. Unno's term, excessive individualism, might be a little bit of a euphemism, right? You've heard the term doom scrolling, right? So, besides being observable in the world of politics, this excessive individualism is something that's also, I think, rampant on social media and YouTube. There tends to be a lot of ranting there. But here, Dr. Unno sees a great potential in Jodo Shinshu to address the problems created by excessive individualism. This is where Namu Amida Butsu comes in. He stated that inherent in the Nembutsu, Namu Amida Butsu, is, quote, an insight that can produce a more awakened understanding of the self and its relationship to the world than anything else being offered today. Only a teaching that is able to see the individual in relation to a larger whole is one that's capable of sustaining and nurturing a peaceful and productive public and private life. Dr. Unno then explained how Namu Amida Butsu expresses this relational self that is at the heart of Buddhism. Quote, Namu is the isolated self which is lost, directionless, and confused. But within the compassion of Amida Buddha, one finds oneself, one sees their self as actually a relational self and gains a true sense of their unique individuality. It is true because the self is now seen as interrelated and interconnected with all life. Now, when Dr. Unno mentions finding one's true self, I think that this discovery or insight actually harkens back to the awakening of Shakyamuni Buddha. This is because in Shakyamuni's awakening, he received the profound realization that rather than being an independent, separate being, someone apart from all other beings, he was actually not separate at all, but his life was intimately connected with all other life. There's no such thing as a separate, permanent self. In other words, in Buddhism, a self is true when it is selfless. And with this awakening, Shakyamuni saw that his life was interdependent with all the other lives. And now, of course, although Pure Land Buddhism does represent a later development in Buddhist history, this essential insight of Shakyamuni is maintained within Pure Land thought. I think this is the essence of Dr. Unno's relational self, the spirit of Namu Amida Butsu. But then, when Dr. Unno also mentions finding this true self, as he says, within the compassion of Amida Buddha, I think he's highlighting one of the ways that Pure Land Buddhism does in fact differ from earlier Buddhism. But I want to clarify here that, in my understanding, this difference between earlier Buddhism and Pure Land Buddhism does not imply anything lacking in the essential teachings of Shakyamuni Buddha. Instead, scholars of Pure Land Buddhism have pointed out that the Pure Land tradition, a part of the large Mahayana branch, is notable for its great emphasis on the wish or aspiration to bring all beings to awakening. And unlike earlier Buddhist traditions, Jodo Shinshu is not a monastic tradition, and so regardless of being priest or lay, and as a matter of fact, regardless of gender, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of sexual orientation or social status, this tradition has as its highest priority bringing all beings to awakening, or to use Pure Land terminology, to birth in the Pure Land, birth in the spirit of Namu Amida Butsu. I think this compassionate wish for all beings is movingly expressed in Amida's 18th vow, which is in the largest sutra. Amida's 18th vow declares, "Unless all beings throughout the world can become Buddhas by sincerely calling my name, Namu Amida Butsu, I myself cannot become a Buddha." So in other words, Amida's attaining Buddhahood is dependent on everyone attaining Buddhahood. And in order to bring all beings to awakening, this requires a tradition whose Buddha, whose teacher, or whose inspiration represents infinite compassion. This is Amida Buddha. This is the teaching of Jodo Shinshu, a teaching and tradition that embraces all life. You might remember that in my opening, I did mention wanting to discuss the teachings of the Buddha, and particularly the manifestations of the teachings here on the altar, which includes the central statue of Amida Buddha. And so here, you might find it interesting that the compassion of Amida, which Dr. Unno mentioned, is actually given concrete expression in the particular way that the statue of Amida, when viewed from the side, appears to be slightly leaning forward. In other words, Amida is coming to us. In conclusion, I think it's the hope of all of our teachers that we realize that our lives are interdependent and interconnected, and that we awaken to this relational self, as Dr. Unno explained. This is a precious benefit and guidance that our teachers and tradition offers. And I just wanted to add that I personally think that with this guidance, the person of Namu Amida Butsu, the person with an understanding of their relational self, will naturally tend to find a way to work for the benefit of all beings. And yes, this guidance could lead to one engaging and being active socially, politically, or spiritually in some way if they feel so moved. And finally, attending services like this Shotsuki service, where we, as members of the Sangha, express our gratitude for our loved ones and really for all the lives that support our life, past and present, and where we reflect on the Dharma and its symbols such as Amida Buddha. These activities are all part of the Buddhist path recommended by all our teachers. And so actually, after the service, you all have the permission of Rinban Kawawata to come up here onto the carpeted area of the altar, which we call the Yoma, the carpeted area, and view Amida from the side and verify for yourself that he is, in fact, leaning forward. So don't just take my word for it. This leaning forward is a key aspect of Amida Buddha because it expresses the essential wisdom and compassion of the Nembutsu, Namu Amida Butsu. So thank you very much for listening today, and thank you for your attendance. Namu Amida.